it's really a pleasure to join you all this afternoon, and I will be giving you an overview on the HESTIA program, which stands for Harnessing Emissions into Structures, Taking Inputs from the Atmosphere. We really like our acronyms at ARPA-E, and this is our program on carbon storing buildings. Next slide. I'd first like to begin by just giving a shout out to the rest of the ARPA-E HESTIA team, who were all really critical in the program conception, launch, and now execution of our active projects. Next slide. ARPA-E is a fairly young agency. We were founded in 2009 with a pretty broad mission in disrupting the energy landscape through early stage, high risk, high reward research and development. And that broad mandate fits under 5 themes. The HESTIA program is geared towards our goal of emission reduction. Next slide. And the way that that ARPA-E came to look at carbon storing building materials and designs was given really the urgency and the need to go beyond developing and continuing to advance conventional abatement technologies such as solar and wind, as well as improving the efficiency of our traditional emitting technologies. But in order for us to get to maintain temperatures below 2 degrees Celsius moving forward, there's going to be a reliance and a need for carbon removal technologies as well. Emission avoidance will no longer be enough. And so it was with this motivation in mind that we looked at where the built environment could play a role in terms of serving as a carbon sink. So moving to the next slide. And really negative emission technologies are going to rely on a whole suite of carbon removal approaches, everything from biological strategies such as forest and land management and soil carbon sequestration, along with engineered approaches such as direct ocean capture and direct air capture. And this is where buildings can play too in these hybrid approaches and serving a dual function. We have to continue building carbon-based products in the form of our built environment. And there's an opportunity to really expand the way in which we think about our feedstocks, particularly in terms of utilizing atmospheric CO2. So the next slide. And that's really where the HESTIA program comes in. What we're trying to achieve here is really addressing a lot of the barriers today to CO2 derived building products. In particular, the fact that there are a number of promising materials out there that are emerging in use that many of you work with and look at as part of your projects. But there are limitations in terms of code compliant options. And so we were really looking at what are ways in which we can really kind of expand the options here and address some of the scarcity, high cost or geographic limitations in these types of materials with an eye towards market adoption, and because codes really form the basis for material selection in building design and construction, that really ultimately was the way in which we were looking at formulating the program. Next slide. So the program itself is a $45 million effort. The projects themselves were selected this past summer and are now under contract and beginning work. And really, what we're looking at through a variety of approaches is trying to investigate a wide range of feedstocks, everything from purpose-grown forestry products to agricultural residues and byproducts from biomass processes to direct CO2 derived products that could be achieved. And the program itself is focused both on developing new carbon negative building materials, as well as taking existing carbon negative materials and designing new whole building designs that leverage the carbon storage properties of the material to maximize their potential, and then really thinking about extending the lifetime of the building and kind of the overall efficiency of those designs with an eye towards designing for disassembly and reuse. Next slide. So within the program, we took an approach of looking at and considering both strategies in the form of mineral-based materials that can store carbon on a centuries time scale and are more permanent, as well as biogenic approaches that can store carbon on the order of decades. And the reason for this is really kind of twofold. One being that bio-based feedstocks can offer us the opportunity to really buy us time between now and 2030 or 2050 in terms of storing as much carbon as possible in the near term as for negative emission technologies more broadly mature and advance and are implemented, and then provide pathways in which that more temporary storage could become more permanent. The other reason really to look at and really expanding some of the sources of biogenic approaches was from the perspective, particularly when we're looking at waste, byproducts, and residues. Converting into a building product offers the opportunity to store that carbon for potentially longer than if that waste or residue were to sit outside and slowly degrade and readmit into the atmosphere. And I should also note that we within the program are including the source of that atmosphere the atmospheric CO2 being very kind of specific there in terms of the overall life cycle analysis, which gets to our next slide. So the life cycle analysis is really the method of evaluation here, with the goal, as I mentioned, on the material side, achieving net carbon negativity, meaning that the embodied emissions is less than the atmospheric greenhouse gases that are captured and stored in the material itself over the specified time period, which is in the finished product. And then there are no the operational energy performance is maintained or exceeded, so there are there's no gate to grave emissions that are exceeded from the current incumbent. And then on the building design side, the goal is achieving carbon negativity at that whole building level, where the total embodied emissions and operational emissions are less than the atmospheric carbon that's stored in the materials of the building itself. And so these are both very, very, very aggressive targets here, but really with the eye of thinking about that whole life cycle all the way out to the end of life. And so the factors that are considered within the LCA include the geography and land use, the source of carbon, the mechanism of carbon storage, and then all the way out to end of life and the carbon retention. Next slide. We have, in addition to the life cycle analysis targets, as I mentioned, the cradle to gate carbon negativity with no increase to gate to grave emissions at the material level, and cradle to grave carbon negativity at the whole building level. The additional performance requirements and metrics are really with the eye towards ultimately market uptake and adoption. So each team has to will have to perform the relevant performance testing for the specific building element that they're choosing or targeting based on what those incumbent specifications are. And so they have to develop a sufficient number of prototypes and prototype sizes with which to perform those preliminary tests. And they also have to show some type of a market advantage to be able to be considered in the future for new projects. So this could be anything from the performance, the operational energy usage, lower cost or easier installation. Next slide. So first off, we have the life cycle analysis component. This is an effort in and of itself within the program. It's being led out of the University of Washington and University of California, Davis is also providing some tool development. And the aim towards the life cycle analysis is really to build out capabilities that are necessary in the future for these types of materials and designs, including development of spatially explicit LCA models to be able to better model regional differences, things like land use change and regional cultivation techniques that are really key to biogenic materials, as well as tracking emissions and uptake over time through dynamic LCA, which is obviously also very critical from a carbon storage and release perspective. And then finally dealing with life cycle, a lot of uncertainty with new novel materials and developing ways to predict LCI based on material properties. And this is where they are going to be working very closely with the materials and design development teams. And so two of the key features here, which I'd like to note, is that we have a built-in semi-annual peer review process, and we would love to work with a number of you in the future to get feedback, as well as having really strict data protection clauses between the teams if and where they're exchanging information. Next slide. And so really we have this kind of handshake going on between the LCA teams and the rest of the HESTIA teams in terms of providing the minimum amount of novel data that the teams are developing through their materials and designs to feed into the LCA tools and capabilities that the University of Washington is developing. And then similarly providing that feedback back to the material and design teams who are being evaluated based on their net carbon negativity. The life cycle analysis itself for the teams is being conducted by them. And the University of Washington team has data transfer, is developing data transfer and use agreements with each of these teams. So the tools and the capabilities that they're developing do not include any access to the data access to the general public, but they're using that information to build out these capabilities, ultimately with an aim of being open source and being something that lives beyond ARPA-E funding and is something that's utilized by your community. Next slide. And so just kind of wrapping things up to show you a flavor for the projects that we're funding. We have a dozen projects on the material side. They are each pursuing not just different materials, but different feedstocks and routes and conversion processes to get there, from insulating materials to new wood materials to extend the lifetime and the properties of that wood, composites, as well as cementitious materials, including biogenic based feedstocks such as the byproducts from sustainable aviation fuel production to biogenic urea to biogenic limestone. And next slide. And on the design side here, we're really kind of focused at opportunities that can really link design decisions with material selection, as I mentioned, to maximize carbon storage, and coming up with new ways to design for disassembly and reuse, and ultimately with that goal of being able to increase the service life as much as possible and that carbon retention. And so these approaches include work with mass timber, as well as opportunities in 3D printing of hempcrete and funicular structures, such as the ones being developed out of University of Pennsylvania, to improve the performance and properties of the structures they're going after. And with that, I think I'm out of time, but I'd like to thank you all and looking forward to engaging with this community even more.